Welcome back to Ask a Real Economist. A question Steve suggested which should be realistic economist. He's going to be here shortly. Make sure you get your questions in the chat, whether you're on X or YouTube for that matter. If you're on YouTube, make sure you hit that subscribe button to the Prof. Steve Keen YouTube channel. Hit the notification bell so you know whenever he releases a new video. How's everybody doing? We're trying this on a Friday now. So it's Friday morning for me. I'm on the Pacific Coast, so it's 9 a.m. New York, it's 12, and then in London it's 5 p.m. We're trying it on a Friday versus a Saturday. There's a number of reasons for that. One, quite a few people suggest it. They like the idea of going on weekdays. And also, Steve releases a video on Sunday, and we didn't want the algorithm to get a little bit confused by that. So, anyways, get your questions in for Prof. Steve Keen, or if you've got questions for me, I'll take them too. Right now, I'm working on a blog. So, this blog is looking at the block universe. I don't know if any of you are into physics, and space time and whatnot. And I find, speaking virtually to the entire economic community outside of a few, it's like talking to philosophers, right? And I'm in the camp of, I don't want to say I'm like Einstein, but I'm in the camp of of physics and engineering and mathematical modeling. So, anyways, I'm writing a blog about that, and I think one of the struggles with economics is human perception. Right now, it's really hard for humans to anticipate the idea that we could live in a block universe, which is completely compatible with the general theory, Einstein's general theory, not Keynes's general theory of interest, money, and employment. Um, so it's really hard to conceive that maybe all points in space time already pre-exist your past, your present, and your future, right? Now, the block universe theory doesn't preclude the fact that you can make individual choices, but they splinter off into different trees, right? And they all pre-exist. And then you can have the philosophical debates in that realm. Like, for instance, the idea of deja vu might be the brain interpreting these other points in space time. But anyways, that's the way I feel about economics, right? Is that you get hardened into your perception. The arrow of time in your mind is really fundamentally one way, right? It feels like time is a flow, whereas the block universe says no. All these points exist, um, throughout the space time, right? That's like system dynamics. So when I build a large scale system dynamic model, all the possibilities are built into the structure, right? So you can, in system dynamic modeling, you can press the play button and the system runs. And depending on and here's Steve right now. Let's bring Steve on. Disappeared on me for a minute, but depending on the structure of the system, right?
Yeah.
All those points actually exist, right? So it's not a matter of playing the play button in your computer. The whole file exists. All the different points of where the system actually is, it exists already. You just haven't pressed the play button. The play button is the perception of your mind if you equate the computer and your brain. Steve, I was just going off on a tangent about system dynamic models and the general theory of relativity. Kind of
A small
steered,
tangent.
yeah, steered it
Ed,
away
Ed,
from
I'll definitely
economics.
just letting Ed definitely got in touch. Has been a bit overloaded recently, but yes, it's Ed Tuhig there, who's another bloody Canadian, but he's actually in his 90s or later, and still one of the most robust people I've ever met, and still campaigning for monetary reform. So a good soul.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
Let's see
Yeah.
if we've got Steve. How you been doing this week?
Oh, mate, I think it's getting to me. I'm just you can only cope with so much madness on the bloody planet before you decide you might as well join them rather than trying to remain sane. So to see what we thought was the end. Not well. It looked like there was maybe a declaration of peace in the Musk-Trump war. Well, blow that out of the water on Monday. Is it Monday? I think it was, or whenever July the 4th was. Bloody Musk comes out and said he's going to start the America Party, dedicated to slashing the government deficit, and then he starts quoting the whole Epstein stuff. And of course, we know the Epstein stuff's not real because the files do and don't exist. Actually, maybe you should call them the Schrodinger files, okay? Because they obviously do and don't exist, and they do and don't implicate people who do and don't live in different parts of the world, which doesn't exist at the same time. I think forget it. There's not enough dope in Amsterdam to make you cope with the current state of the planet.
Yeah, it's quite the now down in the American system, they have a really hard time establishing third parties or even fourth parties.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Versus, I think that's more because of the republic system versus a parliamentary system, which is more amenable to multiple parties beyond
Mm, mm.
two. But Musk is pretty popular, so you never know. But Ross Perot was rich and pretty popular too, and he it never quite worked out for him down in the United States. But it would definitely, if it was a success, it would ultimately split the right vote, and I guess we'd be back to the Democrats. We got our first question though, Steve,
Yeah.
from John. Why are neoclassical's fears of a debt spiral, government debt default, wrong?
Fundamentally, because the government is not in debt. This is what I'm actually. We mentioned before we came on that I'm doing another blog post and another YouTube video on building Musk's ideal system. That's a system where the government has no debt whatsoever, and never runs a deficit. And I might spoil a surprise for anybody who's going to read it, but you find that has various problems, and once you fix all the problems, you're back in our current system. So but fundamentally, the government is selling bonds that it doesn't need to sell. If the government didn't sell bonds at all, then the result of the government running a deficit would be it'd run up an overdraft at the central bank. And it happens that the central bank is owned by the Treasury. So the Treasury probably would forgive itself for having an overdraft at its own bank. But if you then say, well, no, we've got to sell bonds to cover the deficit, your first port of call is, well, let's sell the bonds to the central bank. And then the central bank, as well as rather than an account going into overdraft, the bonds we sell to the central bank will be equivalent to what it would have been the overdraft. So there's the bank, the Treasury has a zero balance, and in its account, and the central bank ends up with positive assets, which are the bonds, and they were equal to their liabilities, which are reserves. That'd be the outcome. Then, with that situation, the banks would be really angry because they'd be with the government running a deficit, selling bonds just to the central bank. What would happen is that the private banks would end up with masses and masses of reserves, precisely equal in quantity to the bonds that were being sold to the central bank. But the reserves would historically earn no interest for banks, and they can't trade them. So they're a shithouse reserve asset in that sense. So you could say, well, let's fix the system where we'll sell the bonds to the private banks instead, and then that'll give them a double bonus as well as getting an asset which will pay interest on, just out of the generosity of our own hearts. This is the government paying interest to the private banks, and that'll compensate them for the cost of running the payment system. So it's not like if you and I don't have money and want to borrow it, we've got to go into debt. Okay, that's the definition. The government could actually do exactly what it's doing now without selling bonds at all. And so it's nothing like the same situation that the government debt's going to overwhelm us. It's easy for individuals to get into a situation where they can't service their debt and they go bankrupt. The government could actually function quite effectively without selling bonds at all, and therefore, in that sense, not being in debt. The one negative it would have would be that overdraft at the central bank, but the central bank is owned by the Treasury. So, it's it is not the situation that people think when they don't do the accounting. And when you do, all these terrors turn out to be like Chicken Little afraid the sky is falling.
So, just to be the devil's advocate, I think one country couldn't eliminate a bond system, a sovereign bond country. It would have to be an international effort. And so, one of the risks, an argument would be said, okay, the U.S. stops issuing treasuries tomorrow, and the
Mhm.
U.S. dollar tanks, and that would apply to any other nation on the planet if they were the only one to not
Mm.
back up their pseudo debt, as you
Yeah, yeah.
put it, right? So it would for markets, it's an indication of bond yields of the strength of that currency. So there's that argument, and I've thought about it myself, and I thought, well, maybe the only way that could work is if there was an international agreement to end sovereign bonds.
Well, the other thing you can do, I mean, this is what annoys me so much about this panic about the government being in debt. The other way to solve the problem, have the current system where the government does sell bonds equivalent to its deficit and plus interest on existing bonds. Get the central bank governor to buy all outstanding bonds tomorrow and actually pay a higher price. So there might be $45 trillion worth of bonds outstanding. There's not though. They think about 30 trillion. Let's offer them 35 trillion to make a $5 trillion capital gain, and that would probably get people dying to buy the bonds. Turning up to the auctions because hey, what a bargain! $5 trillion capital gain, and then the next day the banks would start to complain because where's our interest income gone? And to me, it's just a charade. And what's annoying is that so many people don't realize that because they don't understand the accounting and they don't realize they have to understand it. And economists are to blame for that bit of idiocy in the first place. But once you do the accounting, there ain't nothing to worry about. And that's what it's so frustrating. Having invented Ravel with its godly tables, and it's obvious when you use that software that there's no problem with the government debt, serviceability, and the interest payments. You're creating too much money for the banks. You're not getting an unsustainable debt that compounds. You're just giving them too much bloody money. So cut the interest rate, which is also controlled at the short end, at least by the Federal Reserve. So it's just watching people who don't understand a sports car, who've hopped into one and are trying to drive it around the Nuremberg circuit. And you watch them crash and crash and crash and crash and crash. Everybody blames the car. It's actually the driver.
Yeah, interest on reserves is quite interesting. So it creates a floor, an interest rate floor between banks. So banks
Mm,
aren't going to lend between each other below interest on reserves. It's a bit of a leaky floor because institutions like Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae don't get interest on reserves, but
mm,
depository institutions do. So it's a pretty solid floor. But the act of doing that pumps a bunch of reserves into
mm.
the system, which is actually pumps a bunch of reserves into the system, so it's trying to push it below that floor, and it can't. And then when,
Mm,
the Fed wants to do traditional, monetary operations, open market operations, it's become extremely hard for them to do that because 'cause we're so flush now in reserves, right? It's just,
yeah.
beyond the need of settling between banks now, it's
Well and
just
truly. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So anyways, let's go to and Mark, yes, you can ask your question about foreign aid. Fire away and I'll try to pick it up. We got a question that kind of ties in to long bonds. My question is that I believe the Fed will cut short rates a lot later this year. Do you think long rates will go up or down? Also, why do you think credit spreads are so narrow, Steve?
Well, they are going to be cutting rates if they see inflation falling. The correlation between one and the other is virtually zero, but their model tells them that falling inflation means they can cut interest rates. Um, so I can see them cutting the rates that way as well. The long rates, the shorter the rates are, the more the government's got control over that rate because they issue bonds anywhere from 1 year to 30-year bonds, and the 1 year bonds. You basically you get the interest that's marked on the bonds. You're not going to get a great deal of value fall if there's an increase or change in interest rates. But the long bonds, because there's an inverse relationship between bonds interest rates and bond values, the longer the bond's maturity, the more that uh, relationship hits, and there's far more market power in terms of what people are willing to buy and sell on the secondary market. Long rates are probably going to go up, but you can get inversions in the yield system as well. You can have short rates higher than long-term rates. The more they cut the short rates, the harder that is to have happen. But yeah, overall, I think long rates are likely to come down as well. But to me, it's all people fiddling the wrong dial on the ship, because the reason that interest rates are such a focus of discussion these days is that the neoclassical economists first of all proved, I hope you can see the inverted commas around that word, proved that fiscal policy is ineffective. And then they said that using some simplifying assumptions, and notice there are inverted commas around that as well, we can show that the interest rate is the only tool you need to manipulate and control the economy. So shut down fiscal policy and hand it all over to the central bank, which happens to be staffed by neoclassical economists, so we know they're going to do the right thing. It's all a bunch of myths. If you go back and take a look at how they proved that fiscal policy was ineffective, this came out of what's called rational expectations. Ultimately, you go right back to John Muth's paper on rational expectations and the theory of price movements. And neoclassicals are wedded to this, but it actually involves contradicting their own logic. And this happens all the time because the theory is fallacious. So at various points to get results they want, they've got to sprinkle fairy dust on the logic. So John Muth argued, I know this is a long-winded answer to the question, but you've got to go back and see where the source of these things are to understand where madness comes in. So what Muth was trying to do was to eliminate the microeconomic model that's called the cobweb cycle. And that was the argument applied. It's also called the hog cycle in America, because what you'll find is there'll be a high price for pigs, one year, and therefore that leads to high supply the next year, which exceeds what the demand is, so the price falls. And then when the price falls, the producers produce far less hogs, so the next year there's a shortage of hogs, and you go in this indefinite cycle. And Muth, being a hardcore neoclassical, argued this, that the market is irrational. We all know the market reaches equilibrium because the market is rational. So what he said is that expectations solve the problem. What happens is people's expectations of the future, and this is pretty much a quote, since are informed predictions of economic events are essentially the same as the predictions of the relevant economic model. So in other words, your expectations are exactly the same as the economic model the economist is using to predict the future. And then he tried to justify it. He said, the reason this happens is, one, information is scarce. Now, if you're sort of neoclassical saying information is scarce, what do you think the next phrase would be? Information is scarce and?
Honestly, I don't trust
Well,
neoclassical thinking.
no, just saying, if something's scarce, is it free?
No.
Exactly. Okay. If information is scarce, then the neoclassical assumption, and therefore it's got a price, and therefore the rational consumer should buy that thing, information, up to the point at which the marginal revenue, the marginal utility of the information is equal to the marginal cost. If you buy more information than that, you're being irrational. Okay? So the sensible thing, information is scarce, and therefore people will buy only enough to maximize the gain they get out of it given the cost. So therefore information is incomplete. That's what he should have said. What he actually said, quote unquote, was information is scarce and the economic system generally does not waste it. That's bullshit. Okay? Because if you, again, from a neoclassical point of view, because if there is such a thing as perfect information about the future, and you've got to be neoclassical to even talk in terms of information about the future, but if information did exist up to the infinite quantity that, yes, you could, if you paid the full price, you could predict the future, the cost of doing so would eliminate the gains from doing so. There'd be no point. You'd be irrational to use all the information. Therefore, in a well-functioning market system, information would be wasted because the part of it's just too expensive to pay for. Now, and so they start off with a total contradiction of their own way of thinking. Information is scarce, and we assume it's free, and the market doesn't waste it. So we use all the information. Therefore, the expectations of people inside the model are the same as the predictions of the model, and therefore it's what's called the policy ineffectiveness proposition, PIP. I can think of better acronyms for it. Poop would be closer, but PIP argued that government policy would be ineffective, and you'll like this one because you know a bit at the Phillips curve. Said under these assumptions, the government cannot exploit the Phillips curve for even one period. Okay, even one period, because they cannot fool the public. But the public has all this information, which they got for free, and they're using all of it. So they know that if you increase spending this year, therefore there has to be taxes to be paid in the future. And because those taxes to be paid in the future are going to have to come out of your pocket, you save for those future expenses. So government spending, which is supposed to boost the economy, actually leads the private sector to spend less, and therefore government policy has no effect. That's the policy ineffectiveness proposition. I mean, this would be a great stand-up comedian in a mental asylum, okay? The sort of stuff they come out with. And then my favorite is a guy called Robert Barrow. Ever heard of Robert Barrow?
Nope.
Okay. I'll send you a couple of papers to have a laugh there. Barrow made this, what he called the Ricardian approach to budget deficits. And whenever you see a neoclassical using the word Ricardo, it means they're trying to dress their ideas up with a bit of fancy, credibility from a past thinker. They've never read Ricardo. Ricardo thinks they got stuff as garbage anyway. He was forever attacking Say over having similar thoughts to what neoclassicals do now. But Barrow made the same sort of argument that policy was ineffective because people would rationally anticipate that if there was a boost to government spending now, have to be taxes in the future, so they'd save now so that the net present value of the money they save would pay those taxes in the future. And he got replies, and this is actually written in a bloody paper. This is why Economic Journal should actually be sold in comic shops. That'd be more realistic. And you'd pay a fortune for some of the stuff because it's so fucking funny. But what he argued was, so somebody said, look, okay, yes, we accept that people would, if the government spends more now, they'd put aside money to pay those taxes in the future. But people don't live forever. So what if somebody thinks that the taxes are going to fall in a future generation? And again, I've read this stuff so many times I can quote it without seeing it. Barrow said that argument fails if taxpayers are currently saving for future generations out of, now what word would next if you're a neoclassical economist? Out of? What would motivate you to do something? Huh?
Out
No,
of saving?
self-interest.
Oh,
Self-interest. Okay. What's the word he actually uses? You're going to love this. Altruism. A
oh.
neoclassical economist appeals to altruism to hang on to confusions of neoclassical economics. So he said, this argument fails if current generations are saving for future generations out of altruism. Under that assumption, current generations, when they go shopping, are effectively planning with an infinite future. Okay? This is the shit on which this neoclassical edifice is elected. And then people who read this stuff or don't read it, they just read the sanitized version in textbooks. Most of them have never read an ancient journal paper. They only read the ones that they're trying to get published and compete with their friends. This is madness. Okay, so but this madness is necessary because the neoclassical system falls over as soon as you bring in time, which is something you and I are quite conscious of. And Keynes realized this back when he wrote in the 1930s, but he didn't he was working with slightly less crazy neoclassicals back then. And there's a wonderful line in, I think it's chapter 17 of the General Theory, one of your favorite chapters, one of mine too. He said, I accuse the classic economic theory, we meant neoclassical, he used classical to describe the neoclassical at the time. I accuse the classical economic theory of being one of those pretty polite techniques designed for a well-paneled boardroom, which deals with the future deals with the present by abstracting from the fact that we know very little about the future. Now what we've got is a bunch of economists who deal with the uncertainty by assuming we can predict the future accurately. And, in that situation, all you get out of them is madness, but it's dressed up as science.
Yeah, I try to steer away from all neoclassical philosophy, as I like to call it, but I do look at their DSGE models a lot, right?
Oh, that'd
And
be
I
good
always
fun for you.
I always caution students when you see a superscript +1, that's them saying they know the future. So they actually
Oh, the
solve
plus, yeah, of
their
course, the plus
huge
ones, yeah, yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
ET plus
they
1.
actually
Yeah,
solve their
it
model backwards.
that's right. They iterate future
Th
and
they've
this yeah,
reversed the arrow of time to go backwards. They are now time traveling to
I just wish
solve
the
what
arrow had
they
hit them on
think
the way through.
know.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
and the trouble is, once people get caught up on this stuff, they think it's sophisticated. And, it's clever. Like, for example, one of my good friends well, we've lost touch because he doesn't believe in COVID. He believes it's a conspiracy, so he won't talk to me anymore because I wear a mask. But this is Michael Kumoff at the Bank of England, who's a top-class DSGE modeler, and he's about the only neoclassical who understands that banks actually create money. But when I showed him my stuff on modeling the financial system with their complex systems approach, he said, "I'd like to see how this gets changed by bringing in forward-looking expectations." Now, again, they get so used to the idea that we're trying to explain how intelligent agents act through time. So therefore, we can assume that agents have forward-looking expectations, which happen to be the same as the theory of the model, and therefore everything converges to equilibrium in the future. So they see no problem with working from the future and iterating backwards and thinking that's dynamics.
yeah, it's terrible. So
Yes,
if interest rates change today by 1%, apparently 50 years in the future, I'm going to know my consumption patterns
that's right.
according to the, uh,
I
uh,
think that
Euler's equation that they use in their
Yeah,
models.
I've got to. If this is, give me a tick to find some stuff on my machine here. But like this is the sort of stuff that neoclassicals swallow this stuff without realizing how damn insane it is. And the most insane of the lot was de Breu's theory of value, which people um, like de Breu got the Nobel Prize for his work on um, on value theory. I think of the theory of value and axiomatic analysis of economic equilibrium. I'm trying to remember the quote I'm looking for here all of a sudden. Uh, okay, let's see. Uh, yeah, I was going to look up the word. I've got to look at the word identical. Okay. Uncertainty, chapter 7 of the Rose Theory of Value. Here's the introduction. I'm going to read the whole damn thing out. And at any point, if anybody still thinks neoclassicals are sane at this point, go watch a Donald Duck cartoon instead. The analysis extended in this chapter to the case where uncertain events determine the consumption sets, the production sets, and the resources of the economy. A contract for the transfer of a commodity now specifies, in addition to its physical properties, its location and its date, and an event on the occurrence of which the transfer is conditional. Here's the punchline. This new definition of a commodity allows one to obtain a theory of uncertainty free of any probability concept, and this is really the punchline, and formally identical with the theory of certainty developed in the preceding chapters. Are those uncertainties the same as certainty? Easy, really. Yeah. So, people wonder why I get so angry about the crap, the neoclassicals all the time. It's because they don't even realize they're standing on this shit. Okay? They, they, it's, pardon me, you can see I've had a bad week.
Well, on that note, let's give you another question to
Yeah,
increase
yeah, warm me up. All
increase
right.
your maybe, utils for happiness. We'll get into that.
Utils,
Let's
yeah.
see. For Graham, question for Steve. As private debt is the problem through private banks, what would you suggest to replace these banks with a sole national bank with regulations or reasons for lending? Thank you. So he's saying
Mm.
replace commercial banks with one national bank.
Yeah, I mean, I'm I've gotten a lot of people want to just get rid of the capacity of banks to create money. So things like the Chicago Plan, the Australian American Monetary Institute, and so on and so forth. They're all about removing the capacity for banks to create money. Um, and I have an ambivalence about that. I don't know if I'm going to maintain it, but I do have an ambivalence about it. Uh, because then the question becomes, well, how do you decide who gets the money? How do you hand it out? And um, and it's possible that you need the on the ground experience of individuals assessing other individuals to do that well. Now, instead, what we've had a whole consolidation process in the banking systems pretty much globally. So most regional banks in America are taken over by majors. There's major centralized decision making is made on loans and so on and so forth now. And what that means is people get loans based on mechanical criteria. You know, what assets do you have to back it up? Fundamentally, whether you get a loan these days depends on whether you have an asset that the bank can seize if you can't pay the loan. Richard Werner, and I have lots of problems with Richard on things apart from private money creation, but he knows his stuff on private money creation, made the point that one reason Germany did succeed, it's starting to fail now, but it did succeed in its industrialization, was that its banking system was distributed and localized. And what you had was a local bank manager who would know people in the local area who were reasonable risks, and they'd assess the businesses they were putting forward rather than simply doing a point scoring and whether they've got assets that the bank can use to cover itself if they can't finance the debt. And I got my own, this is a little cameo of my life, but I got my own little exposure to what that can mean when I went to a friend's house in Germany before a conference, quite a distance, about 150 kilometers from Bonn, 130 kilometers. And it was July the 4th, and it happened to be that date with these annual concert put on by the local philharmonic, effectively, around an ancient caldera of an ancient volcano. And this is a town of 5,000 people. And my host introduced me to an old couple sitting on one of the park benches and said they run the major firm in the village of 5,000 people. And I asked what it was, expecting it to be sauerkraut. And the answer was satellites. So these two old people, really my age these days, are top-class engineers who got a loan from the bank to establish a satellite company because the bank manager realized their talent. And here's a tiny village in Germany making satellites. So this is the idea for a dispersed collection of banks, private banks, making loans to genuine entrepreneurs and genuine companies rather than lending on the basis of point scoring. So I'm not a fan of a single bank, and I am in favor of regulations on lending, and a large part of it would be to prevent banks lending to cause asset bubbles. And a large part of what they're doing now when they lend for mortgages and they lend for share purchases through margin loans, all they're doing is lending to create asset bubbles. So economic activity is the side effect of asset bubbles. And that's one reason why we're in such a pickle.
Yeah, I agree with your assessment there. Now, the States, so if I'm a North American, I'm Canadian. So the States, you have about 15,000 bank brands. Up
Yeah,
here in Canada,
15,000. Yeah.
yeah, up here we have, I think, 10. It's about 10. We're very, very highly regulated and
Yeah.
considered, and of course, is considered by conventional economics to be one of the safest banking systems on the planet
Mm,
because we are found that happy medium to satisfy, the free market, folks, that we have multiple banks,
mm,
but also satisfy the regulatory folks that they're highly regulated. Um, so I agree. The idea of a national bank is a slippery slope on a
mm.
political level. Like, does the government decide? Is the government efficient enough to decide what's
Well,
productive?
this is one other thing that I mean, I'm a great fan of and a partial beneficiary of crowdfunding. Not as much of a beneficiary as I'd like to be, but I would imagine you could actually. One thing I've contemplated is could you replace private banks deciding who gets money with not with the government deciding who gets the money, but the government giving everybody a certain amount of money which were like equivalent to the amount of credit created by the private banking system each year, which is of the order of 6 to 10% of GDP, much larger than government deficits normally are. They give them that money and say, all you can do with it is decide who to allocate it to in terms of firms that you think that might have a profitable venture. And then in that case, what you'd be doing is getting the crowdfunding, wisdom of crowds, to say which ventures should get funding and which ones shouldn't. And that may be better than letting banks do it, because what banks have fallen into is it's much easier to work out whether there's a house on a property than to work out whether somebody's venture is going to be a successful industrial enterprise. And what's happened over time is banks after the Great Depression and World War II were relatively responsible in their lending and did actually provide a lot of working capital for corporations. But they then found that that was not profitable for them. Their lines of credit didn't make as much money as lending for real estate. So they stopped lending for lines of credit predominantly. And now you get banks lending largely for housing. And that means that they go and see whether there's, they used to go and check and see whether the house was sound on the property. And I have bumped into so many bank managers over time who got retrenched in the consolidations that occurred, and then got jobs where they'd go and assess properties, whether they should be making a loan for this particular house or not. And they told me that they used to be asked to go inside and check the houses. Said now I just drive past and see whether there's a house on the block. So you get a really dumb decision-making process out of centralized banks, which point score, and then are really looking at whether the borrower has the asset to back what they want to do. And therefore, the only people who get money are those who've got assets. So it actually makes the system even more unequal. You can only be an entrepreneur if you're already wealthy. Great. Okay. So that's a real weakness of it. Whereas if you said, let's create that amount of money, or give people that amount of money to allocate to whichever ventures they think might succeed, they're being encouraged to actually do a bit of research, because you got this free money. If you give it to somebody who folds, it disappears. If you give it to somebody who succeeds, you get a dividend flow out of it. It may be better to use crowdfunding for that basis than using the private banks. But at the same time, that is never going to happen. I'm so used to making suggestions about reforms that I know are never going to take place. So I think that's one reason I spend my time trying to improve how well I model the existing system, because I know the chances of reforming it are basically zero.
Yeah, it is true. It is true. When I was running my trucking company, it was next to impossible for me to get a $5,000 line of credit, so an
Yeah,
overdraft from my bank.
yeah,
And that year, I think, around $1.2 million in revenue. But because like you said, banks have fallen into a trap. Is what's the underlying real asset? Now, on the flip side, right now, I could leverage the hell out of this little condo I live in and get 3 mortgages,
yeah, yeah.
which is retarded. But I
Mm.
couldn't get a $5,000 a business overdraft loan
Yeah,
to cover some costs for something that can be very productive in the future. One, because I think loan officers aren't well versed in actual businesses in their community,
that's the
so they're
trouble. Yeah,
so there is the argument, okay, let's have diversification in private banking, but you also have to have diversification, with the loans officers actually being a part of the community. One thing I always thought about was regulating venture capital and merging it with commercial banking. So
yeah,
a
yeah.
certain part of loanable funds are out there. I know we
Mm.
hate that word, but there are funds available to be loaned by rich people to entrepreneurs. And that would also be backed up by a portion of new bank created money to get the system rolling in the direction of productive bank loans, and kind of symbiotically linking that with venture capital. So there's skin in the game for some capitalist
Mm.
to encourage the bank. Okay, some capitalist has put their own skin in the game. That must mean there's probably some productivity gain, some productive gains here where we can extract interest. That might be one idea. Speaking, you spoke of your Patreon. You can find Steve on patreon.com/prof Steve Keen. You can find me on Patreon, patreon.com/
Oh my God.
relearning econ. I'm forgetting the name. And so we have a question from a Patreon that's Patreons to both of us. It's Zoe
Okay.
Lindsay. I'm sure you remember Zoe or recognize the name. What
Oh,
do
yeah,
you
Zoe. Hi, Zoe.
what do you think the inflationary pressures of climate change should be? Which policy tools might be effective to manage this? Steve.
Well, the main thing that's going to be there'll be so many things destroyed by climate change. This is why I find it depressing to see how little people are aware of just how dangerous the situation we're in is. But the fundamental problem that I can see coming up is at some point there will be a famine. I think it's virtually guaranteed. And it's some climatic catastrophes will strike, completely wipe out one grain growing region or damage several, and mean that the amount of grain both rice and wheat and corn and so on, is not sufficient for 8 billion people to stay alive that year, then you're going to have a global famine. And if you don't have buffer stocks existing of food, then people are going to starve. No, you can't say, who's going to starve, but people are going to starve. So in that situation, if you left it to the price system, the price of food would go through the roof because that's what you ultimately need. It doesn't matter, forget about taking international flights if you can't eat. So food becomes expensive, and the rich can get it, the poor don't, and you have a social breakdown coming out of that. So I think when we're likely to see inflation hitting food, first of all, but the response of governments is likely to be to enforce rationing as much as they can do it. So I see us breaking away from a price system entirely when we start getting caught in those sorts of traps.
Good stuff. Here's one I'll answer. Why can't people understand MMT? Well, there's two reasons. One, people don't understand it because they're not using tools like Steve Keen's Ravel software, formerly known as Minsky, which can really give you a visual represent so your eyes can conceive the system. But the majority of people do understand MMT and just philosophically don't agree with it because they're probably not looking at the system as a whole, don't believe that there are idle resources, and they're just simply never going to believe in it, right? And there's some valid things not to believe in MMT. That's okay. But if it's just a descriptive aspect of it, if they're having a problem with that, well, they should go download Ravel and that will
Yeah,
solve the problem.
yeah. I mean, that's the point. It is the section of MMT derived from the proposition that the government doesn't tax to spend; it spends to tax. That can be confirmed by accounting, which is what I've done with Ravel, and it's 100% rock solid argument. The only reason you don't understand it is because you can't actually see the structure of the system, and that's one reason I call Ravel the monetary telescope. Because if you look at why did Galileo enable us to overthrow 1,500 years of the dominant belief that the Earth was the center of the universe, and therefore the Earth was stationary, and the sun and moon and planets, and sun and moon and stars and planets orbited around the Earth on perfect concentric spheres. That was the previous vision. When Galileo designed, he didn't invent the first telescope, he designed the first one that had a factor of 20 or 30 magnification. And that meant you could actually, rather than postulating what these tiny dots in the sky are doing, you could actually take a look at them 30 times magnification. And at that point, 30 times magnification, rather than the moon being this, strangely colored, there was the man in the moon and all that sort of stuff. We now know it's the seas, the Mars and so on of the moon that caused those color variations. But people thought it was a perfect sphere. Well, Galileo takes one look and there are craters. And what that means is the heavenly bodies, which is what the planets and moon and stars were supposed to be, had to have collisions. And therefore goes heaven being perfect. That was the first thing. But the biggest thing that Galileo saw was when he turned to Jupiter some weeks later, I think, after he first made the telescope. And I think he saw 4 dots of light in the vicinity of Jupiter that nobody had ever seen before, because he literally had the world's first telescope. And he was a bit puzzled by that, but he then came back a day or so later and found that 2 of the dots have disappeared and the other 2 are on the other side of the planet. And he suddenly had the realization, my God, there are moons orbiting Jupiter. And therefore, rather than believing that the Earth is the center around which everything revolves, now you can see that there are moons revolving around Jupiter, which meant that Jupiter was a mini version of the solar system from Galileo's point of view. Now, when he tried to get the Ptolemaic astronomers to look down the telescope, they refused. And it became a point of comedy between him and Kepler, that the Ptolemaic astronomers, who believed they understood the universe, would not look at it through a telescope. And this is the same situation for so many people. So people think they already know. This is when we come back to the monetary system. People think, oh, look, your government's in debt. It's just like a household, to quote some genius called Elon, I think his name is. Just like a household, and just like a household can overspend and go bankrupt, so can a government. They reason by analogy. And if you say, well, look, you can actually take a look at it using Ravel and see what the structure is. and none of them go near it. Now, at the same time, I've got to say MMT hasn't exactly been lining up to take a look at Ravel either, which pisses me off, because if you can see the structure, then your answers become so much clearer than if you end up fogging your way through by analogy, which is what most people do, and get it completely wrong.
Yes, system dynamics, we call that the dependence on mental models. And when you actually take your mental model and you look through a telescope or some sort of
Yeah.
lens that MMT likes to say,
Mm.
that's when you start seeing things that you didn't quite conceive in your own noodle. Because
Yeah, yeah,
your own noodle is always looking for the most comfortable path of understanding, right? And that's where people get trapped into echo chambers and different cults and
yeah,
whatnot, and because it brings a sense of comfort of understanding. I found something that I understand and I'm going to stick with it because it's very uncomfortable to then look at something, even though everybody has the ability to critically think and
yeah.
challenge their own views. It's very, very uncomfortable to do that because you lose friends along the way. But
No kidding.
I don't really care.
Yeah,
Here,
it's a good thing irascible bastards like you and me, we can cope with losing friends.
yeah, fuck 'em.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Here's a good question.
What did the rest do for us?
I got this one. How economic study helps to become a billionaire? Well, I'll tell you that the key to that is to be more monetarily savvy than your neighbors, be more monetarily manipulative than your neighbors, and become a sociopath.
That
You will
helps.
become
Yeah.
rich. So if economic study you want to use that to become rich, you bottom line, drop your morals and
Mhm.
you're well on your way. I've thought about it myself, but my better half, my significant other, wouldn't allow me to go down that road. So that
Oh,
question
damn.
is tackled, but we do have a legitimate one here about your book, Debunking Economics. I'll just bring it up. Here it is.
Mhm.
From Adrian. Dear Steve, in debunking
Mm.
economics, in some chapters, you kind of express some equations and words. I am thinking about the integration by parts, for example. Do you plan to write a more mathematical version of debunking economics? And I'm assuming in the future. Steve.
No, in the past. Um, yeah, I mean, I wanted to, but the trouble is I just don't have time anymore. So what I have done is I've written a mathematical version of my attempts to develop a new economics, and that's actually coming out pretty shortly. And the working title of that book, actually, I'll bring up the image if I can in a sec, Ty, because I used Grok to create the cover image for the book. The working title of the book is, I remember the title, um, Money and Macroeconomics from First Principles for Elon Musk and Other Engineers. Okay. And in that, I said, because I'm allegedly writing to an engineer, I want Musk to think of the system like an engineer rather than like a person arguing by analogy. Then I thought, okay, I'll just use differential equations as a shorthand to communicating the ideas. So I've done quite a bit of mathematics there. I've also developed a critique, a mathematical alternative to the theory of the firm that neoclassicals use, and that idea is that firms produce to the point they profit maximize by producing where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Now, when you take a look at actual firms, none of them do that, not because they don't do the calculus, but because they actually have constant marginal cost, not rising, constant or falling marginal cost is the rule for the vast majority of factories. They set a markup on that as a list price, which gives them their price. So they charge the same price to all potential buyers. But the gap, the profit they're making in each, the change in profit in each for each new sale is price minus variable cost, which is equal to the markup, which is always positive. So the firm continues making a profit so long as it sells more units. And then that means that you don't get anything like the equilibrium outcome of neoclassical economics and their theory of the firm. You get evolutionary struggle, and therefore you get parallel distributions of firm sizes and industries rather than perfect competition or the other myths of the neoclassical paradigm. So I'm producing a mathematical version of that. I would like to do the other, but the trouble is, again, I said I don't have time. I wish I had the financial independence that I could actually devote myself to that, but I don't.
I hope one day me and you actually sit down and write a book on a national model, which would
Yeah,
include
absolutely.
which would include all the equations, and it would be the next general theory, but that's just me dreaming. We do have another question here, and I've got a suggestion for it. See if I can bring it up. Is there any good economic textbook for beginners that is not bullshit? Well, I'll let Steve answer after me, but one that I really, really love, and it's very focused on microeconomics. And I developed a model and put it on my Patreon once that showed what Steve was just talking about, marginal costs. And it's Business Dynamics by John Sturman. It's
Oh,
about
yeah, okay.
thousand book page textbook, and it's got lots of examples. One, to model and dynamic systems, which is the first reason why I'm suggesting that book, and two, it's based on business. So if you have an interest in economics, it is the perfect combination between the two. I also would suggest, I haven't read it myself and I forget the name. And Steve, you'll remember Mike Radzicki, and you did a little piece in it. It's his book. What's it called? It's based on dynamic. I forget it. It's Mike Radzicki edited it. You were in it. You remember the name,
Oh, yeah,
Steve?
that's a collection of all of different authors writing on system dynamics. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's in terms of a textbook, something that can actually give you an introduction. They're probably too advanced in those two cases. Like I generally say, don't bother learning economics, learn system dynamics, and apply that tool to economic analysis. And that's pretty much what you're saying as well, Ty. But if I had to say a particular book that's worth reading as a positive introduction, I'd actually go back to Koleski because he had a book called in 1954 called The Theory of Economic Dynamics. And as a general framing for how one should analyze the economy, there's a lot of good information inside there. There's one by Jan Kraegel, which is also quite old, but when I was 19 or 20, I think I read it and it gave me an explanation for Joan Robinson's approach to economics. And that's by Jan Kraegel, and that's called Post-Keynesian Economics, A Reconstruction of Political Economy. But in general, if looking at what I want people to um, be able to develop a new economics out of, then I'm going to have to recommend one of my own books, which is A New Economics, a Manifesto. And that's showing that you don't need all this micro nonsense. This is one of the one of the reasons neoclassicals never learn from the past is their real territory is microeconomics. That's what they base their thinking on. They even try to derive their macro from microeconomics, and they do it badly and wrongly, and so on and so forth. But they they will never understand the macroeconomy. Forget it. They're just never going to get around their heads. But what they're trying to do is find a shared foundation for modeling the macroeconomy. And that's a good, that's a decent objective. This is they chose the wrong foundation of micro to derive macro from, which you cannot do, even if micro is right, which it's not. So I realized when I was over the last 7 or so years that the models that I've been working on, Richard Goodwin's model, my model of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, and then also the sensible side of modern monetary theory, which is the argument the government can stabilize the economy, they all come out of using macroeconomic definitions. So I simply use the definition for the wages share of GDP, do log differentiation of that, and that then tells me that the wages share of GDP will rise if wages rise faster than GDP, which is a fact, it's not a model, and then put some simple simplifying assumptions in to link one system state to another. And if I start from two definitions, wages share of GDP and the employment rate, I get Goodwin's growth cycle model. If I throw in uh, firms borrowing to finance investment, I get Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. And if I throw in the government having its spending being counter-cyclical, I get a complex systems version of MMT. So I explain that to some extent in the manifesto. You can also, the one I'm writing for Musk will have that complete explanation. I'll bring the cover up and show that. That might answer your question, and I'm hoping to self-publish that as it happens, just circumstantial reasons as to why, in about the next month or so. So grab another question, Kai, and I'll grab the cover and then bring it up and see what you think.
I got one here for Zoe. I have tried debating economic theory with large language models. Actually, Doug and I did that a lot. So we decided
Yeah.
to just create our own large language model. and so
Yeah.
now we debate it and train it.
Okay.
The problem with the large language models and debating economics is with it is it's dominated by conventional economic information.
That's right.
So you're not really debating anything when you debate with large language model. You're debating the patterns that it
Yeah.
sees in the words that you're typing. So it's kind of actually hard to debate AI because it's just you're debating already pre-established information that it can find patterns in. So you will either feel like you won because you know that it's using conventional thinking, or you'll feel like you lost because it can think way faster than you and come up with snappy responses. Next question here. Oh, here's a good one. Steve, do you model wealth inequality when you model economics?
Fundamentally, yes, because by starting from the social classes, which is what I do in my modeling, I've got workers and capitalists, and workers earn wages and capitalists earn profits. You've instantly got a distribution of income concept tied in there because money going to workers is their income, money going to capitalists is their income. If you change the share of profit to wages, you're changing the level of inequality. If capitalists get more, workers who are the majority get less, you increase inequality. But one of the intriguing outcomes of my model of Minsky, and this is the emergent property thing that Ty was talking about earlier, where the model has results that you didn't expect, but they end up being real in terms of what are known as emergent properties of a complex system. When I included banks in my model to get a model of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis out of Goodwin's model of a cyclical economy, I had this bizarre phenomenon turn up that the cycles got smaller. The volatility of growth and employment got smaller, and then it started to get larger. So you had this diminishing cycles followed by rising cycles and then a breakdown. And I couldn't understand it until I worked out that this was the income distribution was actually driving it. So if you start from the proposition that capitalists determine the level of economic output by deciding how much to invest, and that's the main engine of economic growth. If they say, let's say they invest exactly what they earn in profits when the profit share of GDP is say 10%, and they invest more when it's more than they earn when it's 15%, so they've got to borrow money, less than they earn when it's say 5%, so they pay off debt. Uh, what that means is the 10% share of GDP going to capitalists is the equilibrium point between stability, where the capital, where the it's the point where capitalists invest exactly what they earn. So if you have whenever the economy gets back to that point, then the cycle restarts at that 10% level. Now, it doesn't matter to capitalists whether 90% is going to workers or 90% is going to bankers. Okay. So if you start off the system where there's no private debt, all the money goes to the working class, 90% goes to workers, 10% to capitalists, you get a stable level of investment. Then you go through a cycle where firms borrow money to invest more than they uh, when they're getting back in profits. So they have extra debt. They therefore got to pay interest on that debt to bankers. So the banker share goes up. You go through one whole cycle and say you go from the share being, say, 10% capitalists, 90% workers, to 10% capitalists, 80% workers, 10% bankers. The capitalists still did the same thing. So what is actually causing those cycles is an increasing amount of money going to bankers and a falling amount going to workers. And that is an essential part of getting the behavior in the models that I see in the first instance. So inequality and distribution of income is built into the way that I model economics.
Yeah,
What do you got there, Matt?
this is basically your insight that's kind of built into our national model,
Okay, yeah.
and it's showing the declining wage share right after COVID in our model. And if I bring up the Fred
Mhm.
data, how do I do that? Replace share screen with. So this is
Okay.
the Fred data, and you can see the spike of the wage share going up for households during COVID, and then declining again. This is the phenomenon that Steve is talking about. Does he model inequality and as models. And he did, I think, as he just described indirectly, he discovered the emergent property in
Yeah,
his own modeling that indeed households were losing their share of income over time. And this is,
but
of course, back to the 1930s, and we've seen a decline from the 70s onwards.
that's right. And that's when the level of private debt took off. So one of the, I got a bit lost in my explanation there, but the fundamental cause of the uh, cycles was a diminishing amount going to workers and an increasing amount going to bankers. And this is even though in the model, the people doing the borrowing are the capitalists, not the workers at all. So and this is where the emergent property comes in. The fact that uh, the capitalists were happy at a 10% share. I mean, they didn't care what the other two shares were. So if a rising amount was going to bankers as the debt level rose, capitalists, it didn't matter. They still did the same thing. So even though the capitalists are doing the borrowing in my model, the people who pay for that extra borrowing in terms of their share of income are the workers. So there's ways, and that's what you see, that turning point at 1970 really is when you started breaking union power, so workers couldn't bargain as easily for wage rises then, and you had the rising level of private debt, and that's what the data shows. Rising private debt correlates with falling share of GDP going to workers, and that's what my model generated as a prediction. So it's one of the reasons that when it started to happen, I realized just how realistic my own model was versus the fantasies that neoclassicals pump out.
We got a question here from Bartorio. Steve, you're better at reading than me. Bartorio? Bartolio.
Barturo. It's great name.
Bartoro. You got to roll the R.
I
Bartoro.
can't do the rolling R's is beyond me, I'm afraid.
Why aggregate demand is GDP plus change in debt? People take on debt to spend the money. So isn't the change in debt already included in GDP, Steve?
This is one of the insights that I had initially, which was actually technically wrong, but going in the right direction. So, right from the outset of my modeling, I thought that credit was part of aggregate demand. The increase in private debt was something that people would spend it. So, in some way, the change in private debt becomes part of aggregate demand. And my shorthand used to be exactly what you've got on screen there. That's what I'd say. And I was once remembered having a chat with Michael Hudson when I was in New York one time, and he said, "What is aggregate demand?" And I said, "It's GDP, income plus change in debt." And Michael's reaction was, "Why can't other people see that?" And he and I both saw that there was a role in which credit affected aggregate demand. But when I tried to formalize this case, I had all sorts of attempts to explain how this could happen while you still had the rule that aggregate expenditure is aggregate income. And the reason for that is it's the only thing in macroeconomics that everybody has to agree to, because what you spend becomes income for somebody else. You're the buyer, somebody else is the seller. Your purchase is their income. So expenditure is income at that fundamental level. And I was challenged on this. I developed an explanation around Hilbert integration for those who know their theories of integration, which could explain why this increase in debt turned up as part of aggregate demand. But I couldn't. I did that with Matteo Scriselli, who's a mathematician, a Canadian mathematician, another bloody Canadian, and I couldn't get anybody to accept it. So I got involved in a debate, which is organised by Louis-Philippe Rochon in the journal he used to edit, the Review of Keynesian Economics. He now edits the Review of Political Economy. Uh, but in that debate, Brett Feiberger challenged me and said, unless Keynes can show that his concepts are consistent with expenditure is income, he should give up his attempts to bring credit into aggregate demand. And I realized Brett was right. So I had to see if I could actually explain credit having a role in aggregate demand and income, while also having expenditures identical to income. So I invented a concept I call the Moore tables. This is naming them after Basil Moore, the great pioneer of endogenous money thinking in post-Keynesian economics. And what I had was I broke the economy into sectors, and on rows of a matrix, I had expenditure by each sector. So that there'd be the if I just work, say, with a three-sector model: households, services, and manufacturing. So on one line, I had expenditure by households, and on the vertical, I've got the income. So I've got households, services, manufacturing on the rows, and households, services, manufacturing on the columns. And therefore, the diagonal was the expenditure by the households. The off diagonal was what the household sent that money on. So if you had minus A and minus B dollars per year coming out of households, that was plus A and plus B dollars per year going to services and manufacturing. And that gave you expenditure as identical income. The negative of the diagonal was aggregate expenditure. The sum of the off-diagonal elements was aggregate income. They're necessarily equal. So if you look at just a pure monetary system, you get, monetary turnover being the net being zero. But then you include loanable funds. What happens in loanable funds is one sector lends to another sector. So that was shown as a minus credit on, so let's say services lends to household. You had minus credit as an entry on the diagonal for the services, and plus credit as an entry on the diagonal for the households. The two numbers cancelled out. Then you look at expenditure by the household. There'd be minus credit for the money going down in their account and plus credit for the money in manufacturing going out. So credit cancelled out both in terms of income and expenditure calculation, but interest payments turned up, because the reason the services sector lent you the money is because households would then pay interest to the services sector. So you had one minus interest on the diagonal and one plus interest on the off diagonal, and therefore in loanable funds, interest payments, but not credit, are part of aggregate demand and income. Then you go and say, what's the real world? The real world is banks are the lenders, and they lend by crediting the liability account of the borrower and crediting the asset that they get from that, which is the debt that the borrower now has to the bank. So in that case, you get a single entry on the diagonal for the credit coming out of the increase in the amount of money that the buyer has to spend, turning up on the diagonal, and they spend it on manufacturing in that example. So you get one entry on the off diagonal as well. So in endogenous money, which is the model that post-Keynes has been pushing for 50, 60 years, in that model, credit is provably part of aggregate demand and aggregate income. And of course, when you also look at what credit is used for, large part of that credit's used to buy financial assets, which are not part of GDP. So credit turns up as part of the demand for non-financial assets as well, houses and shares and so on. So you can no longer separate economics from finance, and you show that credit has a dominant role in the economy, because all other elements of aggregate demand and aggregate income can only be positive. They can go up or down, but they can't go positive or negative. Credit can go massively positive and massively negative. So therefore, it's the most volatile component of aggregate demand and income. And therefore, when you try to look at what causes booms and busts, it's fundamentally credit. So that's a long-winded explanation, typical for me, I suppose. But that's why credit is part of aggregate demand and income. But you could only separate them out in the statistical way. Now, questioner was asking, if you could actually find out where did the money that people are doing the spending come from? Was it out of their income turnover, or was it out of their borrowing? And we don't get that information. So you can then imply that by saying how much of the increase in credit in 1 year, how much it was relative to GDP, and then you can say that much of aggregate demand is sourced from change in debt rather than from the turnover of existing money. So my ultimate comeback to that statement, I now would say that aggregate demand is the turnover of existing money plus credit.
Colin, what part of Canada do you hail from? I'm on the West Coast. Just curious. Let us know. Let's see.
I've
I've
got
got what
friends, yeah,
you've got friends in Canada, Steve?
spread across the bloody country. I mean, I can't get rid of you buggers. I mean, you're on the West Coast. I've got Mateus Griselli on the East Coast. He is Brazilian by origin, but he's been in Canada for 30, 40 years. Mark Lavoie in Ottawa, of course. Jordan is in Banff. It's just ridiculous how many Canadians I find myself working with.
Mr. Rashawn?
Mr. Rochon, definitely. Louis Philippe in Toronto. Yeah, I mean, it's intriguing. If I had to say, in terms of which nationalities I found myself working with the most over time, the answer is Canadians.
Vancouver, Colin. I am in Richmond. So
Aha.
We're about 20 minutes apart, buddy. Beautiful Vancouver. What a
It is
great place.
rather, yeah, a rather
What
nice
a great.
place.
Now, I brought Steve to downtown Vancouver when he was over in the winter, and I asked him
Mhm,
to compare it to Sydney. And of course, it
mhm.
was rainy that day. And I took him down to the downtown east side, the grimy part of town, anyways. But I asked him, what was better. I wish I took him down on a sunny day so he could see the coast mountains right there, right outside of the downtown core. But anyways, maybe he'll
It's a
come in
pretty
this.
it's a pretty town. I mean, of all the cities I've been to, I still think Sydney's got the most beautiful combination of natural landscape and urban architecture as well. And like you took me to that park on the point of Vancouver, which is quite attractive.
Oh,
Remember that? Yeah.
Stanley Park.
Yeah, that was
Colin
very.
I Colin and I took him to Stanley Park, way better than Central Park in New York.
Oh, bloody hell, yeah. But
Uh,
we have the Botanic Gardens in Sydney, and I'm sorry, pale imitation. There's something there's Sydney's Australia's stuffed up on a lot of things, but it got the design of Sydney pretty right around the harbour.
I
So,
didn't take you to Van Goosen Gardens. Colin will know where that is, and
okay.
it is epic, absolutely epic.
Mm.
Question. I'll answer this one. Does your national model factor in population dynamics, different age groups, to interface with the economy differently? Kids versus young workers versus mature workers versus retirees. So, in my initial drafts, I used what was called an aging chain, and it's basically a chain of different stocks, each stock representing an age group. And I actually got the idea from the World 3 model.
Mm.
The problem was it took a tremendous amount of research to show how the economic system influenced the birth rates. So for the first stock, how it influenced deaths in each cohort of individuals. But I wanted to do it because I wanted to show retirees in the system extracting real resources from the productive cohorts that are actually creating the real value, because MMT is correct. The government can just fund pensions, but the reality is that the real value has to be created by some cohort in the system. So, from a real perspective, young fund the old in retirement. So, I wanted to get into that, but I just didn't because I didn't have the time to do the research. There are population dynamic exclusive models that are kind of just focusing on those dynamics. I would love to integrate an economic model with population dynamics. And I'm sure Steve would love to do that, but it's a tremendous amount of work. You're working with non-linearities on top of non-linearities, and it's an incredible battle. But you are correct. Those different cohorts interact with the economic system in different ways. So something I wish I can do maybe in the future if I have
Yeah,
time, or if I make my millions of dollars becoming a sociopath and
it's a good idea, yeah.
manipulating people monetarily and become a billionaire, as one of our viewers was asking. That is achieved. If that's the case, then maybe I'll have time to do it. Here's actually Eric. He's caught the plot here. He listens to us. The description of these models kind of sounds like predator prey mathematical modeling. Well,
Spot
th-
on. That's exactly
spot
what it
on.
is.
It
The
looks like
funny
we've
thing is, the thing he probably doesn't realize here, which is actually quite a bit of a laugh on this front, is that in the predator-prey model, which Goodwin's model actually is that workers and capitalists, who do you think are the predators and who do you think are the prey?
I don't want to give it away.
No, no, the answer is, and you and I both know this, the capitalists are the prey and the workers are the predators in that model. Mathematically, when you look at the sign of the parameters that are involved in the two differential equations, the prey, the capitalists have the same sign as the prey, the workers have the same sign as the predator in predator-prey models. So, and that was actually Goodwin was quite aware of that and wrote that as part of the punchline of his model in 1967. And so, and in fact, I think in the predator prey modeling, I think is extremely important as a overall explanation for the varied nature of life on the planet. Because if you look at the diversity of life that we experience, they've got to shut this farming bloke up and answer his question. I'll just quickly do that. He's pumping this question every bloody 2 or 3 seconds. Don't do either. Do a degree in mathematics, okay? And then learn people that work of mathematical models of the stock market. You'll do better that way than anything you get out of economics. Economics will mislead you. So go into a mathematics degree, look up the name Didier Sornet, Sornette, and check a few other mathematicians and physicists. Don't waste your time or ours asking about doing a master in economics. Sorry.
Yeah, Furman, you're asking the same.
You've asked the questions.
You've
Yeah,
heard it from Steve. Shut the fuck up.
exactly.
Now,
Yeah.
let's get to a person who just gave you $5. I think he
Oh,
has a
well, this question
question.
with, hey, Graham,
Yeah,
you got a
question with
name,
money.
the same name as a great mate of mine, by a guy from the CSIRO. I take it it's not the same person, but yeah,
Can
Graham Turner was somebody I worked with on the limits to growth studies. So a very good character indeed. So thank you, Graham. Okay. Yep.
can an economy run a government deficit with no capital or household money creation? And if so, for how long, Steve?
I could do it indefinitely because the government creates money by spending more than it gets back in taxation, uh, except for bond sales by the private banks to non-banks. That means the government's deficit is the rate of creation of fiat money. And if you wanted to have a sustainable, growing capitalist economy, which of course I always preface that I'm forgetting about global warming when I answer that question, but to have a growing economy, say growing at 6% nominal, say, you know, 3% inflation, 3% real, then you'd want a government running a deficit of roughly 3% of GDP. If the rate of turnover of money was twice per year, and that would then enable you to expand the economy at that rate indefinitely. So at a technical level, you could run without, there's no household money creation unless you have a printing press in your basement. So, let us know about that. We could do with some of the free notes. But if you leave out private money creation, you could still have a completely public money system. But the thing is, we started with private banks, and private banks have become so part of the capitalist system, you'll never get to the stage where the government takes over unless, and this is my big unless, bringing in climate change, when, and I don't mean if, I mean when, climate change starts to destroy the productive capabilities of our economies, then in that situation, the private banks will collapse, and the only monetary system that will be left that's functional will be fiat money creation. I'm leaving out. Thank you, Farmer. Please don't trash us like that next time, okay? When you look at the, I lost my train of thought by replying to start to Farman there. So the government can do that indefinitely, but we won't see that change until the private system breaks down, because when climate change starts to wipe out productive resources, private firms will be unable to pay their debts. Households will be unable to pay their debts. They won't be able to insure their houses anymore. In that situation, the private system is going to break down, and the only one we're going to live with is the fiat money system. Even like people might think Bitcoin can be an alternative then, I think that when we really see how far we've overshot the sustainable capacity of the planet, when that realization strikes, governments which have been paying lip service to it for the last half century will suddenly go, seriously, holy shit, this is serious. What the hell can we do? And two of the fastest things they can do is shut down cryptocurrencies and shut down international travel. That'd knock about 6% off our energy consumption in one go. And I can see that happening at some point. So you could run on a deficit alone. I think we'll be forced to at some point. But without something which is completely catastrophic for the capitalist system, you would never see that reform come through. Oh,
I
good.
just
Okay.
want to go back to the prey model here. I'm just going
Oh, yeah,
to.
good. Okay.
Why am I?
God, your stuff looks good
There we go.
compared to mine. I should be.
Now
Okay.
I have a million copies of this model designed in every which way. I think this one I just want it for teaching purposes, lists the feedback loops. But I was thinking that there was a few comments in the chat. It's not outside of the realm of possibility to consider any two-state system. So in this model, all you have is capitalists and workers. That if the economy was really that way, workers would indeed probably be the predator and you could interpret it that way. But as soon as you other add other agents to the system, like a
Yeah.
financial system, the perception of that idea kind of breaks down. But in this simple model, if the economy behaved as just two actors, can I run it from this screen? I can't run it.
Should be hit the run button. There we go. Yep.
Right, so you get the predator prey dynamics, and what this model is you have your K, which is your capital stock. It's one system state, and you have your wages W, which is your other system state. So as K goes up, it can produce more output, which is Y, which we have a constant rate of productivity represented by alpha. That means labor goes up. We have in this one, I just used a linear wage multiplier. So as
Yeah.
labor goes up, wages go up. The average wage level goes up. You times the wage level with the amount of laborers, you get the wage bill, which subtracts from profits. So profits go down,
Subtracts from output.
or it subtracts from output. So profits go down. And in this simple model, all profits are invested, which we know is not the case in the real world. But for a teaching purpose in this model, all profits are invested. That means there's less investment, and K will either slow or decline, which then reverses the cycle. So now Y goes down, L goes down, wages go down. Now there's more output than there is wage growth, and so profits go up, and the cycle returns. That is the predator prey model, just a little more advanced. So if anybody was wondering what the hell we were talking about there, that is the original Goodwin growth cycle model. Steve came along and added a function for investment. So based on profits, there would be a slope. The more profits, and I've tested this out statistically, as profits go up, firms become more, you could say, euphoric and say, well, the good times are never going to end. Let's invest more and invest beyond profits. And if we're investing beyond profits, we add a third system state, which is credit, which accumulates into debt. And then you get a three-state model, which starts getting into the theory of chaos. And so he added that. I think, Steve, you added a depreciation to the model.
Yeah.
You
Goodwin had
added
forgotten that. Yeah.
an exogenous growth rate to both N and alpha. And if you look at his PhD paper, he also has capital utilization rate. He also makes A or alpha endogenous. So you can take this model is like, I always call it like the Pentium core of
Yeah.
any. This is like the base case of the economic business cycle, and you can build up from there. And stop
Okay.
sharing. We'll
Now that
bring
you
the
just let
chat
me have a
up.
bit of fun here, Chris. Quickly, I'm going to share my screen. If I can work
Okay.
out how to do it.
Okay.
That's let's see. 'Cause I want to show the cover done with Grok. Actually, I've got to say it's one time that I found AI useful. So I want to do a presentation here. Entire screen. This one. Move you. Hang on. Move over here again, and then go share. And hopefully, hope you see it. Can you see my cover of Elon Musk yet?
There we go. Let me
There you
move.
go.
Let's move the ticker. Let's turn that off. There we go.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's
Money and macroeconomics from first principles for Elon Musk and other engineers.
and Grok was a pain in the ass getting Grok to produce something like that, but I love the stunned mullet look that it gave Musk there. I think that's absolutely perfect compared to what he's actually got us caught up in. He thinks he's going to make the system work better, and he's going to have a lot of crashing economies on his hands. But hopefully, in about 2 weeks' time, that'll be available.
2 weeks time, it's coming up. You should have released it at Christmas or something. Maybe some sort of
I should
Christmas.
have written it at Christmas, but
Yeah, I
and
guess so.
I started writing at Christmas or near enough to Christmas, and I stopped writing the book for Reeves and Starmer at the time because it reminds me of of an old female friend of mine, not a girlfriend, but she used to have said on a sticker on a fridge, "So many men, so little time," There's so many idiots, so little time to write books countering their views.
We got a question from Toko. Steve, please explain the science behind inflation targeting. Our central bank is planning on reducing it in capital letters.
The bit being inflation, yeah. Well,
Yes.
I think you've got to, this is a bad word. If you use the word science, that's not what's going on here. You've got a bunch of myths. The first is that neoclassicals think that with stuff I started the discussion with earlier on about this idea of rational expectations being unsound from the point of view of neoclassical theory. But what came out of their argument was that inflation was actually caused by expectations of inflation. That's why you see central bankers wanking on about inflationary expectations all the time, because the thing which causes prices to rise in their model are people's expectations that prices will rise. So if you want to stop prices rising in their model, you've got to get rid of the expectation of prices rising, and that's why they think their announcements are so important. Uh, there's no sense to it at all. And the best work, we should get her on one day, mate. The best work on inflation is done by Isabella Weber, who's a non-orthodox, a post-Keynesian economist at the University of Amherst. Not a Canadian, so far as I'm aware. I'm letting the side down here.
Isn't she
Okay.
German? She's German, right?
Weber's a good start, but I know she's German originally, or German descended from Germans in America for some decades. I have no idea. But yeah, she's done the serious work on inflation from the post-Keynesian point of view. And when you look at the empirical record, the way to control inflation is to reduce conflicts over the distribution of income, because it's not a case that money supply growth causes inflation, which was Milton Friedman's way of thinking. It's that struggles over the distribution of income cause increase in prices, which then causes a change in the money supply. And that's where the endogeneity of money ideas first came from Basil Moore, because he said firms will have negotiated. This is back in the 70s, where it was genuinely the case. Most major corporations, all major corporations had lines of credit with major banks, which is basically like having a credit card where there's a limit and your expenditure is well below the limit. If you then had something, I don't know, like let's just say there was a war between Israel and the Arab states. That happens occasionally, doesn't it? And as a response to that, the Arab states ban anybody who supported them. And that was, let's say it was America that did that. Then you got a fourfold increase in the price of oil in 1 year in 1973, 74, from $2.50 a barrel to 10. Now, that was imposed on the corporate sector effectively. So the corporations started paying $10 a barrel for oil rather than $2.50 a barrel for oil. And that price increase was passed on through the whole system. So but what it did was, because the banks accessed their credit cards, they created the money that was necessary to pay that higher price for oil. So the causation that we find is actually not from the money supply and then the interest rate to inflation. It's from struggles over the distribution of income primarily to the monetary system. So inflationary targeting is based on a whole range of dreams and myths. It doesn't work, and we should really have control of inflation being something which is directed at a sort of prices and wages commission rather than being controlled by the central bank.
Sounds like she's carrying the torch of Koleski forward
Yeah,
in a
and look,
more
Koleski's work that was the first one to do that. So he did that brilliant engineer's decomposition of output and prices to say that you can. And I think he's doing a scalar argument when you think about it, because he said there's a money wage cost, and you have a markup on that money wage cost. So that's effectively saying the only external cost for firms is wages, and therefore the markup is on wages. But of course, there are external costs for oil and a whole range of other things that are not produced by firms as well. Energy inputs fundamentally plus labor are probably the two. So you could do a markup on both of those and say that the price level is the markup on the primary external sort of firms' costs, whether that's workers or energy, and then the output per worker or per unit of energy. So what you get is the inflation you can break down into the change in the markup, the change in the money wages or the money price for oil, and the change in output per worker or output per litre of oil, that sort of thing. And then when you take a look at the data, that explains the booms and busts that have occurred in inflation over time. And it's fundamentally nothing to do with the money supply in that sense. The money supply reacts to it. It doesn't cause it or constrain it. But you do get exceptions when the government creates an enormous amount of money like they did during COVID, which was, if they didn't do it, the system would have collapsed. So a huge monetary spike that then gave both workers and capitalists room to get higher money wages and higher markups. And we therefore got an inflationary surge because both sectors effectively saw that there was room in the market for putting up prices, so they did.
I once I don't have a graphic of it. I'm looking, but I once kind of took an advanced equation of Koleski and I ran it in the United States for inflation from 1990 to 2024, and it performed quite well. So
Mm.
I think it's a valid underlying base case. So it's good to see Weber kind of taking that forward. I'm always a little bit leery on terms like greedflation because I understand in a capitalistic system that firms are always going to try to maintain a markup. That's
Yeah,
why they are in business, right? And if we go back to the predator prey model, if we flip it on the head and say the capitalists are the prey, if we could, that's essentially their role is to mark up prices and make a
yeah,
profit. And it's part of the system, so I'm always a little bit leery on assigning blame. Oh, it's the workers; their wages are rising too fast, or it's markups, firms, or corporate pricing powers. I'm always a little bit leery on that because I know it's dynamic, it's a
yeah.
variable. If you set up that equation, it's a variable and it changes through time. But it is good to see Weber. When I interpret her work, I see Koleski, so that's great. We
Mm.
have a super chat from our buddy JB. We have not seen you around in a while. JB, $5 Canadian. Oh, right, JB. We've talked to him via email about Ravel before. I can't remember your name, JB, but we've been in email contact. He is a Canadian, another one, engineer. And he was actually I had sent him my PID controller
Oh,
model
yeah,
that I had built in Minsky, right? And he worked out a low pass filter for me. So I was having trouble using the differentiate block and
yeah.
feeding it back into the system. And he kind of just taught me, well, you actually in that loop, you're cancel if you just use a differentiate block with an integral
One
block,
cancels the other.
one cancels each other. So you make a low pass filter, so a second integral block, and yeah, great, smart guy. Anyways, he's got a question and he's paid you money, so we're gonna do it. Hi, Professor Keen. In Buffett's trade model, looking further into the future, won't the trade surplus flip with Squanderville paying rent to Thriftsville? And this is going back to your video a few weeks ago.
Knocking Warren Mosel and supporting
Yeah,
Warren Buffett. Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, yeah. So what actually that's what Buffett's point. He actually finishes on that point in the paper. So for those who haven't read it, I think it's a great little mind model. I'd like to actually make a Ravel model of it again. I haven't had time to do it properly. But what Buffett was arguing was against the idea that the trade deficit is beneficial to America. So he made up a mind experiment where there are two islands, Squanderville and Thriftville, and on both of them, the only output is food. The only capital item, so to speak, is land. There's no capacity to make any other capital goods. Bit extreme, but this is a useful mental model. And he said that if every person in both Squanderville and Thriftville worked 8 hours a day, they'd make enough food to live, and that's what they both did. So Squanderville and Thriftville, everybody works 8 hours a day, and they feed themselves, and there's no international trade. Then he says, what happens if Thriftville people decide to work twice as much? So rather than working 8 hours a week, they work 16 hours a week, and they export the surplus food to Squanderville. And Squanderville thinks, well, this is cool. All they want back is Squander bucks. So we're going to buy the output of Thriftville with Squander bucks, and the Squander bucks can't be used in Thriftville. So the Squander buck, the Thriftville per, export surplus will be used to buy squander bonds, and there'll be an income from the squander bonds. Then they get to be dubious about whether they can rely upon the government of Squanderville. So they then convert those bonds back into squander bucks and buy the land. So ultimately, Thriftville ends up holding all the land on Squanderville, and in that situation, and that's what Buffett says. You finally find yourself being dispossessed in your own country because you've still got the workers there, but you don't have the capitalist anymore. In Buffett's example, you've still got the workers there, but the land of Squanderville is owned by Thriftville. So in that situation, the workers in Squanderville have to work not just to produce food for themselves now, so they're working 8 hours a week to make food to survive. They've got to work another 8 hours a week to pay the rent back to the owners of Squanderville land in Thriftville. So yes, it's not the trade surplus that turns around; it's the services, the payments turn around. The capital account means that uh, there's trade there's now an income flow going from Squanderville to Thriftville to pay the debt that they currently owe, as well as having to work on the land. So it does turn around. And that's basically his point. If you run a permanent trade deficit, then one way you finance that is through the capital account, and you end up having no local capitalists. You basically have a country of workers, and the money is sent offshore to the benefit of foreign capitalists. Okay, what you got? Let's see. Okay, your PID controller. Hello, you there, mate?
Hold on here. Now I'm back. Sorry,
Good, good.
I mute myself so I can sit here and vape in the background right
Oh, do
close
you
to
know?
my
Okay, okay.
yeah, just like
I'll have
puff
to top you and do something in Amsterdam shortly.
just puff real hard on that thing, and I think it
Oh,
comes out pretty loud, so I turn my mic off so I don't look unsophisticated, but anyways, so this is the PID control, and this is a great thing about Ravel, formerly known as Minsky, is it is a design because it's got the godly tables to be like a monetary modeling system, but it at its core, it's a system dynamic program, and you can model anything. And PID controllers stand for proportional, integral, derivative controllers, and they control things like your cruise control in your car, right? And so you don't oh you want to try to control it. So in this case, I've controlled it so it lands on the black line at the fastest possible point without overshooting too much. So imagine you set your cruise controller in a 90-kilometer-hour speed zone area, but you overshoot it and you go to 120 kilometers and you get a $300 speeding ticket. Well, PID controllers are a practical term to avoid that. And what I learned, if you look at D down at the bottom,
drive in there. Time, just zoom in a bit, mate.
let's see if I can go to that screen.
There we go. Good. Yep. Okay.
So if you look at D, when I originally had done it, I was struggling with getting it to work. So this would represent the derivative. And so the difference between an integral and a derivative is a derivative, like the derivative, you're measuring the change in the line itself, where an integral, it's smooth, it's everything below the line. And I'm sure you've heard Steve explain this for integration purposes. It's a lot more stable to measure the changes of everything below the line. It's a lot more stable instead of a volatile change of the line itself. But
The slope
anyways,
of the line. Yeah. Mm.
right? So if you follow D, it goes through all its variables and comes to Y, which actually, if I created a loop here, loops back in itself. And what I discovered when you differentiate and you only have one integral in your system, it cancels each other out, and I was getting a zero value. And
Yeah.
what JBay came along, he actually took this model. And he's like, "Oh, this guy's an engineer, and this is why I trust engineers more than economists. He
Bloody
solved it.
hell. Yeah.
He solved this problem, and he was just starting. He has used FinSim and Simulink, and he's used all those programs, and he was just kind of playing in the waters with Minsky for the first time. And within
Mm.
5 minutes, he comes up with this low pass filter, right? And he explained to me, that you're canceling out these two, and I didn't know that, right? So
Mm.
this is why I say engineers should be economists, or you should take an engineering degree, and I think Steve, you suggested this many times, and then apply it to economics. Maybe you take your 4 years of engineering and then maybe master in economics or something like that. But anyways, this low pass filter erases all the low signal noise, so it's just a very, very small signal there, and it cleans it up, and you get your, and I'll zoom back in and run it. You get your, this could be cruise control, right? And it tends up to the black line, which is your target. Now you can screw with that, and I think I can screw this right up. And no, in that case, it just takes longer, never quite get there. Let's just seeing if I
You
can.
wanna cause overshoot, do you? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just seeing if I can cause an overshoot here. Oh, I might have just screwed it up. Well, there. Now I screwed up. Now I screwed up my low pass signal, and of course, then you get something like this. But anyways, um, that's kind of what I was talking about with JBay. JBay, if you're still there, thanks. You taught me something. You see, I learned more from physics and engineering than I ever will from economics. Ever, ever.
Yeah.
Steve, you're about the only person I've actually learned anything genuinely, like, useful from economics, and it's the discard it and use Ravel.
Yeah.
That's the
I think I
truth of it, right?
when I wanted to become go to university, I remember going for an aptitude test, and the guy running it, he said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to do economics and engineering or economics and law." And he said, "Do law," and there was no engineering option at all. So when I went through this back in the 1970s, now you can do virtually any combination you like with any other, but in those days you could only do an arts law degree. But the arts degree let you choose any subject at all. So I did 2 years of psychology, which I'd only done 1 year of mathematics, which I'd done 2, but the mathematics that I learned is the foundation of my approach to engineering and economics in general. So I learned more from mathematicians than I've ever learned from economists. I learned from economists is how important it is not to be an economist.
Boy, for an economics live stream, we sure shit on economics.
Oh, do we
We've
ever? Yeah, yeah.
we've got one here. Let's see if I can read the name. Rot D Fave Film, maybe. Steve, to what extent do you think a taxation method like the land value
Land value
tax
tax, yeah.
fits within models like yours and MMT, Steve?
It's an uncomfortable fit. I mean, I must say this is the Georgist argument, of course, and I've got to say that uh, I was actually staying for free as an office with the Henry George League in Sydney after I finished at the University of Western Sydney. So, and I had a lot of Georgists that I knew and like and still like. So my contemporary experience of Georgists has been quite positive. But my first experience was running a conference in 1973 on radical economics, which was a dreadful conference, I have to say. And we had a whole bunch of old Georgists turning up, and they're a bunch of right wing turds that were really quite irritating. And I saw Michael Hudson being asked about Henry George's work and said that one reason he was so popular was his views fitted in quite nicely with right wing attitudes. I've got to find the actual statement by Michael. We might get Michael on as well to discuss this properly. But he's quite critical of Henry George. Now, the thing that George has come down to is this like a simple solution to every problem. There's a single solution, and that is the land value tax. So if you bring in a land value tax, you're not taxing work, you're taxing accumulated value, and therefore you're not distorting productive side of the economy. You're just taking tax out of the asset inflation side of the economy. So that side of things, I'm moderately sympathetic to it. But if my fear is, and I've seen this too many times, not to be conscious of it, is that if you make something, particularly for local governments and state governments, if you make something a source of tax revenue for them, and local governments and state governments cannot create money, so they have to get taxation revenue or sales revenue to get enough for their expenditure. And be covered by federal government funds as well. If you give them something which is going to increase the revenue, like, for example, a land value tax, they will try to find a way to pump up prices to get more tax revenue. So I'm even if the LVT was the ultimate solution that a lot of Georgists argue it is, in the hands um, of state local governments, it would become a reason to cause price inflation, which is a dilemma. Rod said he's never thought it was a single solution. It does fit. I mean, to come back to your question, yes, there is a valid role for that. There are difficulties about it. So you do get the case, and my mother was in this case when she reached her uh, getting close to dying. She had some income coming in, but the house was rising in value much faster than her income was rising. So if she had to pay a land value tax, she'd be forced to sell the house and move out. And that's one of the dilemmas when I'd rather have a land value tax set at the high end, the wealth end of the system, rather than at the low end. And I want to have as much as possible capturing things like if you have the Elizabeth line going through London, for example, that increased the land values of all the properties, commercial and residential, that were on the line, and then you could actually use that increase in price as part of financing the venture when it's financed by a local government on that front. And Joe's saying here that George is about taxing unearned income and economic rent. And on that front, yeah, he's completely compatible with Michael Hudson's attitudes. But you've got to see, Michael did a brilliant takedown of the right wing side of Georgism, and we'll have to get him on one day. He's got this spontaneous capacity to just dump an enormous amount of classical economic history on you and passion as well. And he made good arguments about the limitations of land value tax.
Thanks, Terry. Terry Flynn. His name is Terry Flynn. Thank
Okay,
you for the good question. What do we got next here? Okay, so we had the guy at the beginning of the show asking if he could ask about foreign funding. I don't know if you recall that. And I did bookmark his question ultimately. So,
okay, so
from Mark, do governments give foreign aid in its own currency? If so, that country receiving the aid can only one use it to buy goods from the lending country, or two convert it into its local currency. Don't know
That's a
what.
very correct observation. So, like a large part of United States aid, US aid, was actually as a way of marketing for American companies. Because if you gave US aid, money was almost always tied to buying US goods. And this is one ironic thing about Trump cutting it back because he believes it's, woke, et cetera, et cetera. It's no more woke than, getting General Motors to pump out cars into a third world country. So it was a way of subsidizing American corporations more than it was in boosting the local economy. And that's one reason I love what Keynes suggested in Bangor, that you'd have a tax being charged. welcome, welcome, Ty. Jay Bay, they're saying thanks for the answer and the kind comments. They're very nice to see. Yeah, the idea of Bangor was that there would not be an international currency. There'd be a unit of account. The sum of all Bangor would be zero. Surplus nations would accumulate a positive balance at the International Clearing Union. Deficit nations would accumulate an overdraft. The sum of the two would be zero. But the system would then tax anyone for the companies running sustained surpluses or sustained deficits would be taxed, and that tax would go to a reserve fund, and the reserve fund would be distributed to third world countries. Now, when they got those funds, of course, they could only use them to buying imports. So it was a way of boosting global aggregate demand, and at the same time controlling trade imbalances, which is far, far better than what Trump is trying to do with bloody tariffs at the moment. But it didn't mean the money was directed having to be used for a particular national currency. But in the system we now have, where countries do some of the extent of foreign aid, it's really a subsidy for the local business sector because they give you money in their currency, and you either have to spend it buying their goods or, as you say, convert it into your local currency. But often there are conditions, particularly the United States aid, tied up to buying goods from United States companies.
Good answer. Another money question here. What is the real money supply? M2 or US federal debt bonds? Steve, what's your opinion? What's the real money supply?
Neither. This is one of the great difficulties of monetarism had, is trying to measure how much money there was, because money is a means of payment, and if I can pay something by transferring money from my stock account to your stock account, I've forgotten what they got, ISAs and stuff like that. You have in America, I think, of- uh, mutual funds.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, things of that nature. So when you have a boom going on, people will actually use mutual funds as a means of payment at sometimes. So that means that it isn't just the money in bank accounts, it's also the totals in mutual funds, and they're boosted by stock exchange returns. So effectively, you're capitalizing the stock market boom and turning into buying power in current money. So they found the central banks found it extremely hard to measure and say what actually was the money supply. And they've given up on measuring it these days. They used to have just M0 and M1. Then they had so M0 is reserves fundamentally. That's money not in circulation. It's either cash held by banks and the central bank, not in circulation with the public, or it's reserve accounts of the private banks at the central bank, also not in circulation in the public. So M0 is separate from the other ones. M1 was then check accounts, when you could only purchase something from a check account. You had to literally write a check to buy something off another person. Savings accounts were then added as M2, because we then found that banks introduced savings accounts you could spend out of. So then M2 became necessary. Then you had the money market funds, and M3 came in, and M4 and so on, and they finally gave up on the lot. But fundamentally, the best measure of the money supply is neither of the things you're saying there. It's outstanding federal government bonds plus the level of private debt, because both of those have created money. So it isn't just US federal debt, it's also private sector debt. And private sector debt is normally 2 or 3 times what federal debt is. At the moment, it's only 1.5.
Stuff. Everybody, remember, hit the notification bell, as Steve said on his YouTube channel, Prof. Steve Keen. That way you know when he releases a new video. That's very key. If you haven't subscribed, subscribe to his channel
Yeah.
too. That's a good idea as well. And hit that like button. Comment after if we didn't touch anything. If you've got, a legitimate question, you can put it in the comments and maybe Steve will get to it. If you're over on X, make sure you hit the like button if you're watching there, and then migrate your way over to the YouTube version. I always find YouTube, it's easier to chat on. We got time for one more question, Steve. I'm gonna let it be a Bancor question, and I'm
Idea.
gonna give it to Graham because he did give the British pound to you about an
Okay.
hour ago. So we'll give him one more here. Would returning to a bank or international payment method away from the dollar be the solution to what BRICS is trying to achieve,
Yeah,
Steve?
I think that, to me, I reread Keynes' stuff on Bancor to write those recent papers where I'm critiquing MMT on trade. Um, but when you read it, you get a real respect for the wisdom that Keynes had, because Keynes was saying that having a national currency is a bad idea, and for a range of reasons. He was speaking from the experience of the British. So I've started working out a imperialism cycle try that sort of thing. I was hoping you might have a crack at modeling at some point, and that is that no imperial power has become an imperial power using imported weapons. Okay, they've made their own weapons. Their weapons have been better than the countries they're fighting with. They take over the country. So the English take over India because they invented, better guns and rifles than the Indians had at the time. Ditto for wiping out China. So imperial powers build their own weapons, and then they get to become the dominant country in the international system. And then they insist on becoming the international currency. And what that means is their currency gets increased by value, say 30% rise in the value of what it would be if you didn't have to use their currency for all international transactions. And therefore, the manufacturing sector becomes uncompetitive. And over time, they can't produce the weapons anymore. And they lose out and they cease being the power until another country comes along. So, what Keynes was putting forward by Bancor is, let's get rid of the curse of being the reserve currency. Let's have a system which doesn't require a national currency for international trade, and you'll break the cycle of empires becoming empires because of manufacturing prowess, and then wiping out that manufacturing prowess when they become the reserve currency. So Keynes was trying to stop America shooting itself in the foot, and Harry Dexter Cook firmoed his big toe and blew both them off with one bullet by insisting the American dollar becomes the currency for international trade. And the same thing that happened to Britain's pound has now happened to the American dollar. You go from being a trade surplus nation to a trade deficit. You lose the capacity to develop your manufacturing over time, and ultimately you get replaced as the empire. So the Bancor solution is the way to go. Use a unit of account, not a currency, for international trade. Have floating exchange. I've seen all these bloody MMT types coming back at me and saying, "Oh, Bancor was a fixed exchange rate." It was only a fixed exchange rate because there was no floating system at the time Keynes wrote. It hadn't even been thought about. So if there'd been markets for international currencies with floating values, Keynes would have included it in the concept. He had an adjustment mechanism when countries run sustained surpluses or deficits, as well as the interest rate charge. So he had it was a semi-fixed floating scheme anyway that he put forward, but you could easily use a floating exchange rate. There'd be a floating exchange rate to the Bancor, but transactions of the Bancor would always sum to zero at the aggregate level, and you wouldn't get any country being able to exploit seigniorage for its financial advantage and its manufacturing disadvantage. So I think it's the ultimate way to go. That's what we need, something like the Bancor. And in some ways, one thing Trump might be doing by being such a destructive character in how he's treating international relations, it might persuade people we've got to get out of the system. Let's create something that doesn't involve a national currency for international trade.
Hank, missed you. Thank you again. Steve's gonna have to start giving me a cut for all these super chats you're
Oh,
getting.
shit, yeah,
Super
yeah.
chat,
I'll pay you in Canadian dollars. They're worth a lot more than less.
how frequently do you back up your computers? Well, I don't do it enough every couple months. It's gonna bite me in the ass one of these days. Steve, how frequently do you back up
I've
your
got
shit?
Carbonite as a backup system, but unfortunately, I've got two independent Carbonite systems that aren't talking to each other, I've got to sort that out at some point. But Carbonite does my backup, and then I do a physical backup as well fairly frequently. But on occasions, because I've run out of space on my machine, I haven't backed up some particular types of files. I hope I've got a record of them somewhere, but I've lost all my Mathematica files from my original work on my PhD thesis.
And Terry's back again. He's just giving
Yeah.
you a $20.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you're gonna be giving me cuts here pretty quick. Jesus, holy crap! I'm making money for Steve now. What are you, $35 richer today?
Wow. Yeah. Okay.
I too kicked econ models of individual choice. I made a career using Thurstone
Thurstone.
in
Okay.
1927, who modeled intra-individual variation. McFadden won Econ Nobel by going under the radar using math. Do you like this intra-individual model? This will be the last question,
Well,
Steve.
look, I'm actually not sure. So what I'm doing now is I'm going to take a look at Thurstone and find that paper that you're referring to. And also, McFadden is a familiar name. I'm not really sure. I think I know McFadden's work. A law of comparative judgment. Okay, I'll take a look at that and come back to you on that one for a future live stream.
Yeah, Terry, come back next week.
Yeah,
I'll bookmark this and I'll make Steve do some research this week to give a more in-depth answer for you. Considering you just bought him 7 cups of coffee,
yeah, that's all. Yeah.
he's gonna have to put it or a bag of that magic stuff he likes in Amsterdam. I don't know what the price.
Analyzing discrete choice. Okay. Yeah. I mean, there's some great, just to give a reference back to you that's worth looking at, Terry, and that is there's a great paper by Sippel, Sippel, in the Economic Journal from 1997, where I'm pretty certain what he was trying to do is to make his students realize that all this neoclassical indifference curve stuff actually had serious meaning. So he got his students to do a set of tests about prices and quantities and purchases, where they legitimately were reproducing the axioms of revealed preference from Samuelson's idea of how you could actually find what preferences are by asking people questions about their purchases. And 95% of the students violated rational choice. And Sippel ceased I've since found has ceased being an academic. It's such a shock to his system, he stopped working in it. But that's a very useful example of why the neoclassical model doesn't work. And we use a different model to explain the choices people actually make.
Okay, everybody, it's been 2 hours. We
Mm,
rambled through about 20 questions there. If I
yeah.
didn't make it to your questions, I just looked through the there's 700 comments, so
Oh boy, 700?
I probably missed a bunch there. And I'll try to remember when I see your name. I'll try to rotate through everybody. Joe Polito's always here. He had some
Yeah.
questions, but he's had his questions answered before. So I'm trying to be fair and I'm trying to catch everything. So if I did miss you, it's not because I don't care. It's just because I'm probably not a good producer. But anyways, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, bell, and we will see you next week at the same time. It looks like we got viewers, so see you next week. Bye
Yep.
bye.